Hey guys, so I'm not doing a regular show this weekend. Mostly didn't want to make our video editor Forrest work on Labor Day weekend, but I thought in lieu of that, I'd just do a short stream and answer some super chat questions and talk a little bit about what's been going on, what is coming up for the next show, which is going to record a week from today. So I just got back. My wife Jennifer and I just drove from Michigan back to Georgia, hence the different background here. A couple days ago, still settling in. Hey John, last night. Thank you. We finally picked up all the mail that had been building up while we were gone. So, see, the new issue of Jacobin is here, which is always nice, although the back cover is incredibly depressing. If you can't read that, it says, "In memory of our friend and comrade Michael Brooks, 1983 to 2020. But otherwise, I am writing a book for Zero Books, the next one after the Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, A Critique of the Contemporary Left, is coming out in April. That's obviously already been written. So the one that I'm under contract to write for them right now is about Christopher Hitchens, the subject of many TMBS throwback clips in the last year. Yeah, somebody says they couldn't find Jacobin at Barnes & Noble. Sort of forgot that there still were Barnes & Nobles. But in any case, you can certainly order it online. Just subscribe. In fact, please do subscribe to Jacobin. But in any case, so the book that I'm writing for Zero right now is called Christopher Hitchens. What he got right, how he went wrong, and why he still matters. So as part of that effort, I have been going through, reading or rereading all of his books. I'm probably not going to try to read every single last piece that he ever wrote. All right. Don't know if that makes it better or not, but thanks for the tip, David. I'm not going to necessarily try to read every single piece that he ever wrote for Vanity Fair or The Nation or The New Statesman, but I am going to read or reread all of his books as I prepare to get more of that written. So right now I've been reading this one, Mortality, which is the very last book that he ever wrote. Collects the stuff. I think some of it I remember reading in like Salon or Slate, probably Slate for Hitchens. So it's about his battle with cancer at the end of his life. And, under the circumstances, he has a pretty remarkable sense of humor about the thing itself and the events leading up to it. So the opening line, the first sentence is, "I have more than once in my time woken up feeling like death," which gives you an idea. I also recently read his book about George Orwell, which is a really interesting one to read because you can kind of just see the end. It's transitional, right? So I'm pretty sure it was written pre 9/11. It was published in 2002. Somebody in the chat compared I think the line I just read from the book to Leonard Cohen's song "You Want It Darker," which is kind of funny because in the book he talks about Leonard Cohen because apparently his friends would bring him Leonard Cohen CDs in the hospital and he'd spend a lot of time listening to Cohen. I agree with J. Andrew World, who, by the way, if you have graphic design needs, you should get in touch with him. He's an immensely talented artist. He does all the logos and everything for this show, including an awesome new one for David Griscom's Outlaws and Revolutionaries segment. But Andy says reading Christopher Hitchens is always good. He was a hell of a good writer. Absolutely. And the Orwell book is interesting because, like I said, he He wrote it pre 9/11. It was published after. It was published in 2002. And I think there's like one footnote that kind of, the one I'm talking about is Why Orwell Matters, which I do not have in front of me. I would hold up otherwise. I think I actually left that one in Michigan. But I think there's like one footnote that references some of his bad post 9/11 foreign policy views. But that's totally not present at all in the text of the book. In fact, he's got a great line in the book about how when Nixon and Kissinger visited China, a country they had previously threatened many times with nuclear annihilation, he felt like he had read the news before because he'd read 1984, where there's that line about how Oceania is at war with Eurasia. Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia, just the instant retconning of imperial foreign policy. So somebody asks if I like David Pakman. Yeah, I do. I've been on his show twice, most recently to talk about populism, which is actually a good tie-in to part of what I was going to preview about the show next week, episode 5, because I'm going to be talking to Thomas Frank, who is the author of multiple books that I like a lot. I'm a huge fan of his previous book, Listen Liberal, which is kind of a diagnosis of the Democratic Party establishment. But his new book, which I'm going to be talking to him about, is called The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. And the subject of my last conversation with David Pakman was about populism. And actually, I wish I'd read the Frank book before I had the discussion, because I totally would have brought it up. But basically, the conversation and David Pakman, is certainly more of, I'd be shocked if he thinks of himself as a Marxist. He's certainly more of a, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, normie progressive. So our politics are not exactly the same. But he's a thoughtful interviewer, and I like him. And what we were talking about was some of the stuff that I've written about how these so-called right-wing populists, actually, I agree. So Andy was comparing Nathan Robinson and Hitchens, and of course, in a way, it's a little bit of an odd comparison because Hitchens obviously drank and smoked all the time, and Nathan not so much, but and certainly some of the literary influences and stuff are very different. But I think there's something there, and I think the clarity of their writing. And I think I get some of the same things out of their writing sometimes. But in any case, the conversation with Pakman was about some of the stuff that I've written about so-called right-wing populism, which is actually also something Nathan has written about. And I don't necessarily, agree with every word that Nathan has written about that topic. I'm certainly more of a fan, I think, of Crystal Ball and The Rising than he is. I think they're legitimate criticisms, but I like Crystal a lot. She's going to be on the show in a few weeks, and I think that even if you think that maybe sometimes there are different ways that you should push back against a kind of Trumpish conservative like Sagar, I think the idea of objecting in principle to co-hosting a show with one, I don't know if that's necessarily Nathan's point or not. There are times when it seems like he's verged on that in his critique of it. I think that's misguided. I think that actually it's good to have on and vigorously disagree with people who have those views, because unfortunately that's a huge chunk of the population. And if you're going to reach whoever's reachable in that demographic, then I think having, instead of just you producing propaganda for your point of view and hope that they sometimes stumble on it, right? I think having somebody with Crystal's politics and somebody with Sagar's politics hashing it out is not necessarily a bad idea. And it certainly makes more sense to me to have a show with a Bernie-crat and somebody with like, you know, Tucker Carlson-ish politics like Sagar in terms of yeah, absolutely, Patrick. I'll be taking questions. I'll, you know, put it in the form of super chat. I'll definitely take it, but I might see it anyway, and I'll still answer. But in any case, the point is just that I think having somebody with those sort of, you know, Tucker Carlson-esque politics like Sagar and a Bernie-crat like Crystal makes infinitely more sense than the usual mainstream media thing, which is where you have some annoying centrist Democrat together with a never Trump Republican, which is a constituency of like 10 people in the whole country, and they're all on talk shows or have New York Times columns, and I don't know who the hell that's supposed to reach, right? I think if you actually want to try to convince whoever's persuadable in the part of the population that you know, unfortunately might currently be falling for some of Trump's pseudo-populist nonsense, I think you have to talk to somebody who they might see as more representative of them and not see that as like a moral question. Are those people awful? Yes, right. Not the grassroots people who might be making bad votes. But certainly, you know, certainly people like Trump himself is, you know, a monster if anybody is. But I think that gives you a much better chance of reaching them. But I actually think that Crystal has pushed back in really good ways on a lot of topics, right? So when it comes to stuff like the police repression of the post-George Floyd protests, I think she was very good on that. I think that, I don't know, sometimes people talk about it as if she was like Holmes to Sagar's Hannity, and I have to say I don't see that. Right? I think that she pushes back really aggressively, but also in a really effective way. Like when the two of them were on Joe Rogan, and you know, Rogan sometimes has good politics. Oh, by the way, somebody mentioned the intro music. Should shout out that to Cole James Cash, who produced that for us. He's great. Check out all of his stuff. Really happy, you know, to have that intro music. So in any case, though, you know, Rogan sometimes has good politics. He has social democratic inclinations on a lot of things like single payer healthcare, and there's a great clip from a couple of years ago that I've always loved of Rogan just completely taking Dave Rubin's head off on the subject of the post office and deregulation. But sometimes he falls for really dumb right-wing talking points. And this was one of those times when they're talking about police and possible military repression of the post-George Floyd unrest. And the way that Crystal Ball was pushing back against that, I thought was really good and really valuable. That she wasn't giving an inch. She was pushing exactly the right case, but she also wasn't just denouncing them. You could tell that she was like really trying to convince anybody in the audience who might be tempted by that perspective, right? I mean, like really, I think Crystal Ball is who everybody wants to come to Thanksgiving to argue with their uncle who voted for Trump. And I saw Annie had asked about Cancel Con. Speaking of the tragically stupid Dave Rubin, so this is an event where Rubin and Shapiro and a couple of these other clowns are going to make big hay of weaponizing resentment against cancel culture, and I think that some people on the left have a reaction to stuff like that I think is really not useful. It's really counterproductive. It would certainly be stupid to just say, "Oh yeah, these guys are right," because they're clearly not. But I think the problem that I have is that some people on the left react to stuff like the cancel con nonsense by saying, "Oh, this means that we shouldn't have left critiques of cancel culture anymore, because then you're using the same words as the bad people and you're like giving them power." It's like saying Voldemort's name or something. And I think that's exactly the right approach. I think what we should do, what I tried to do in the piece that I just wrote for Jacobin, which was published yesterday, I think. Yesterday, is to try to take the issue from them, to try to show that the kind of clowns who do things like CancelCon, the Rubins and, lesser men, Ben Shapiro, all these people, they make a lot of hay out of talking about it because, of course, the sort of cancel-y trends in American culture are pretty loathsome to most people, right? Most people's reaction to that is not, oh, yay, accountability. It's disgust, right? That most people sort of see this phenomenon, right? What Peter Coffin calls in his new video, the panopticon as an app, or he also has a good line about Twitter as a punishment Uber, right? And have a very bad instinctive reaction to that. But if we just do knee-jerk denialism, it's like, oh no, nothing like that is happening. There isn't any sort of worrying culture of mutual surveillance and hair-trigger denunciation going on. Then we cede the issue to clowns like Dave Rubin. But I think we could do much better. I think what we can do, what I tried to do in the Jacobin article, which is a 5 years later review essay about John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, from 2015. So the idea was to kind of look at what's valuable in the book, think a little bit about how well it holds up, what's changed since then, and how the socialist left should think about the issue. And so what I tried to do with that essay is to say, look, rather than ceding the issue to the right by just not wanting to talk about it, or just blindly denying that it's a problem, we can provide a better analysis of why it's a problem and what can be done about it, and sort of take the issue for ourselves. So what we should actually say about why it's a problem is that it's a result of basically neoliberalism, right? By neoliberalism, I just mean the kind of current phase of contemporary capitalism that's characterized by a retreat of the welfare state, of organized labor, of all the stuff that made capitalism slightly less horrible than it was, and the rise of the renewal, right, of a much more laissez-faire, much more pre-New Deal, much more liberal in that sense, right, of like lax regime of regulation of capitalism, version of capitalism. And I think that one of the things that results in is widespread social atomization, breakdown of communal bonds. So a lot of people feel the most sense of connection that they feel in their lives online. It's also given rise to a few quasi-monopolistic social media platforms. And those social media platforms, I get into a little bit more about this in the essay, but these are made by the corporations that own them to be as addictive as at all possible. That's why you've got all that little structure. Every social media site has some version of likes. And by the way, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. But every social media platform has some version of likes, retweets that give you this little dopamine hit of social approval that people end up craving all the time. And that tends to reinforce our worst behavior because you have this incentive to kind of monitor each other for violations of taboos that you can then use for social capital, because if you're the person leading the charge, right, you get all this instant approval and validation from other people who share your affinities. And of course, that's even more toxic in a context, again, this is a disease of neoliberalism, of at-will employment and a labor movement that's badly in retreat, all of which means that what we end up, what we end up getting is this extremely punitive, harsh atmosphere. Again, what Peter Coffin calls the panopticon as an app, right? The panopticon was Jeremy Bentham, this early utilitarian philosopher's idea for a prison where the prisoners would be visible at all times and from all sorts of different perspectives. And this was supposed to be an idea for like humane prison reform, but of course, most people who've read about this are rightly horrified by it. And similarly for the kind of DIY surveillance that goes on right now, which, by the way, people like Trump, when he talked about cancel culture at the RNC, or people like these CancelCon clowns, want to make it seem like this is a phenomenon of the left. But somebody says this sounds like an avant-garde German hotel. I like that. Want to make it seem like this is a phenomenon of the left, but it's absolutely not whatsoever. Look at the way that the cancellation of Lindsay Stone. So this is one of the big examples from John Ronson's book. Have to say, I was really happy after the review came out when Ronson said on Twitter that he liked it, right? Since there was a paragraph that was mildly critical, but anyway, so was very happy to get the feedback because I really admired the book a lot. But one of the big examples in the book is about this girl, Lindsay Stone, who worked for this organization with learning disabled adults, was apparently extremely good at her job, beloved by both the clients and their parents. But in her office hours, she and her friend Jamie, not Jamie Peck, a different Jamie, would go around like taking kind of jokey, irreverent pictures of each other, where they do things like smoke in front of non-smoking signs, and then they'd post them on Facebook. This is 2012, for whatever, the 100 people or whatever that they were friends with on Facebook. And like most Facebook users, they weren't paying very much attention to their privacy settings, probably not as much as they should have been. And so they took one of Lindsay Stone posing in front of the Silence and Respect sign at Arlington National Cemetery, going like this, right? Pretending like she was shouting and being rude, just as a dumb, edgy joke. And whatever you think about that. Sorry, just laughing at the chat. But whatever you think about that, you probably don't think that somebody deserves to have their life ruined over it, but this was very much what happened. That about a month after the picture was taken, and probably got a couple of likes and a few comments, most of which were said, I don't know, Lindsay, this seems like kind of in bad taste. But whatever, nobody outside of their Facebook friends noticed it until about 4 weeks later when it somehow got out. And there was this avalanche of moral outrage. And again, this is not the left doing it. In this case, this was extremely patriotic conservatives who were going on about how Lindsay was a dumb feminist who was disrespecting the troops and lots of other stuff I'm not going to repeat, on a live stream. And she was, there was a Fire Lindsay Stone Facebook page that was created that had at one point 19,000 likes. And the next day she was fired. Her boss didn't even let her go inside to empty out her desk. He met her in the parking lot. She didn't get a job for another year. She didn't go out on dates because she was afraid the guys would Google her and see this. She started developing insomnia. And so again, in that case, it's ultra-patriotic conservatives who are doing the canceling. In other cases, like Justine Sacco, who's another person who's mentioned in the book, it's the other way around. That Justine Sacco is an American from a South African family who was going home to visit her family in South Africa, and she tweeted something to all 170 of her Twitter followers. That she thought of as an anti-racist joke. She thought of as making fun of racism. It was about, I won't get AIDS because I'm white, right? So it's like, white people seeing themselves as being invulnerable to these social problems that Africans so disproportionately suffer from. Again, she saw this as an anti-racist thing. Justine Sacco actually comes from a family of people who were ANC supporters during apartheid. But out of context, millions of people interpreted it in the opposite way. She lost her job. There were rumors that she came from this wealthy family that owned diamond mines in South Africa. uh, and um, and that she was like an heiress to billions. Total nonsense. Her mom was a single mother flight attendant. And Justine herself had a good middle class like PR industry job at that point in her life, but she immediately lost it. This is from John Ronson's book, the one that I was doing the 5 years after review of for Jacobin. And not only did she immediately lose her job and had a lot of trouble finding a new one, but like Gawker was going through her old tweets to try to find something else that, anything else that sounded bad that they could use to kind of build this narrative. There was like not Gawker, BuzzFeed, I believe. They did an article. There was like 16 tweets Justine Sacco now regrets. Again, that she tweeted out to her 170 Twitter followers. The New York Post was sending people to follow her to the gym. It was, it's a pretty horrendous case. And the point of bringing up both Justine Sacco and Lindsay Stone is that, Justine Sacco was being hounded online by people who thought she was a racist. So there was some kind of like progressive impulse behind it. Lindsay Stone was being hounded by ultra-patriotic conservatives. The point of all of that is not to equate the two ideological impulses at all, right? I certainly wouldn't. The point of that is just that what we call cancel culture would probably be more accurate to call it denunciation culture or public shaming culture. The old term call-out culture, I think, was a little bit better and less confusing, but whatever you want to call it, it's something that impacts the entire ideological spectrum because it's not something that emerges out of the left or leftism. It's something that emerges out of neoliberalism, right? Again, out of widespread social atomization and alienation, out of the rise of these quasi-monopolistic, intentionally addictive social media platforms, and that has the sting that it does because of the fact that the labor movement is so deep in retreat and most people work at jobs with at-will employment, so they're extremely vulnerable to attempts to get them fired. All of this makes me think that if the left stopped doing this kind of knee-jerk denialism when people brought up the problem, if instead what we said was, yeah, it is a problem, here's a economic explanation of where it comes from that's way more plausible than whatever these cancel con clowns say about, whatever fantasy about cultural Marxism or whatever they think is the source of the problem, then if instead it comes from these concrete material developments about this kind of neoliberal capitalist hellscape that we're living in, that actually points towards real solutions to the problem, right? That if we took social media platforms into social ownership, so there wasn't the profit incentive to continually look for ways to make them more addictive, we could make collective, reasonable social decisions about how it would be best if they worked. If we rebuilt the labor movement and ended at-will employment, doxing wouldn't have quite so much of its terrors, etc. None of these are perfect solutions, but all of these would at least get to big chunks of the problem, whereas the right isn't really interested in solving the problem. They're just interested in weaponizing it and using it for propaganda because it's something they know most people find irritating, and they can try to pin it on the left. The Mark Fisher essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, which is actually from 2 years earlier than the John Ronson book. It's from 2013. I would certainly recommend that everybody read that. I do a pretty deep dive on that in the new book coming out this April. But before we got off onto all of this stuff, I was talking about the conversation with David Pakman, which was about so-called right-wing populism, because I wrote something about right-wing populism for The Third Rail, which is a Substack magazine edited by Ryan Smith, who is one of the co-founders of The Bellows, which then went in kind of a weird direction. But The Third Rail is great, right? They've published great stuff, not just by me. And the article that I wrote there was called, Will the Real Right-Wing Populists Please Stand Up? And the point of the article was that these alleged right-wing populists, like Tucker Carlson, like Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, who, what does it even mean to say that these guys are populists? Well, certainly if populism just means the use of some sort of rhetorical strategy that identifies the people in some sense as the beneficiary of your politics. Oh yeah, Josh Hawley is another person who's often brought up here. And the people are being counterposed to some sort of elite group, then you certainly have right-wing cultural populism. That's existed since forever, right? Right-wingers who make a big deal about, coastal elites trying to shove Hollywood garbage, into down the throats of middle America's children, or, whatever garbage they're talking about. So yeah, that kind of cultural populism is pretty common on the right. It has been for a very long time. But these people like Josh Hawley, like Steve Bannon, like Tucker Carlson, they're supposed to be something else, right? They're supposed to be economic populists, right? That's supposed to be what's distinct about them, that they're right-wing economic populists. Yeah, Pat Buchanan is certainly also in that group. And that's really what I tried to interrogate in the article and what I was talking about in my conversation with David Pakman. Because say, okay, all right, sure, populism is a rhetorical strategy, cultural populism, fine, but economic populism, that actually makes it sound like you're going to do something economically to benefit ordinary people at the expense of elites. And none of these people have the slightest interest in that, right? And, there are leftists who will leave unnamed, but at least one of them lives in Australia, who seem to have a weird soft spot for one or two of the people that I've just mentioned. And I cannot understand it at all, because if you look at what they actually say, none of these people are in favor of any meaningful reforms that would actually benefit ordinary people at the expense of elites. So if you watch, for example, Steve Bannon did a debate last year with Never Trump Republican David Frum. He's the ghoul who wrote George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech in Toronto. It was the series, The Monk Debates, which is like the prestige TV of debates. This is supposed to be like the Monk Debates, like are the kind of YouTube debates that somebody like me would do, like what Mad Men is to 2.5 Men, right? It's supposed to be that much more prestigious. And the debate was about, be it resolved, the future of Western politics is populist, not liberal. So this is a debate between Steve Bannon, who's supposed to be this big representative of right-wing economic populism, and David Frum, who's just a normal Republican, and is a Never Trump guy, so he's like an anti-populist Republican about populism. And if you watch that thing, which I did, I wouldn't recommend it. It's just totally empty. It's nonsense. It's nothing. Because they barely touch on policy at any point in that entire debate. Basically what it is Frum throwing a lot of rhetoric at Bannon, suggesting that Bannon is a fascist, and Bannon throwing a lot of rhetoric back at Frum, suggesting about the glory of the salt of the earth working class deplorables. That's the whole debate. I saved you like the hour and a half or whatever it is of actually watching it, and it's totally empty, right? I mean, I guess Frum won if you want to play that game because Frum is better at rhetoric than Bannon is, but whatever. It was a nothing. And then if you watch this year, it was actually this spring sometime, because I remember it was after the beginning of the pandemic, I saw somebody says Steve Bannon, populism with a 5% surcharge. Bannon went on the podcast Red Scare, which I always sort of, whenever I think of that podcast, I always think about the Netflix show Russian Doll. I always sort of imagine her hanging out with the hosts of that podcast. So Bannon went on Red Scare. Lots of people were very upset with them, the hosts Anna and Dasha, for having him on because they're platforming a fascist. That's the objection. But I'm glad he did go on because it was useful. Michael Brooks did a thing about this at the time, a little segment. You can find it on YouTube somewhere. Because in his Red Scare appearance, Steve Bannon was asked, right? The host, Anna and Dasha, asked him several times, right? Because he didn't give a clear answer the first few times. Hey, you're supposed to be such a populist. Why don't you support Medicare for all, right? How can you be a populist if you don't support Medicare for all? And it's such an obvious question, and it was so obvious that he didn't have a good answer whatsoever, right? That he was just kind of flailing around. Well, I don't know. It's a very complicated issue, whatever. And he had nothing useful to say about it because, of course, the populism is total nonsense, right? Like, and I'm not, endorsing everything that the host said to him. They were very friendly in a lot of times, but like, whatever you think about that, right? I'm glad that he was on, and I'm glad they asked him that question because it was way more useful than that Monk debate with Froome for exposing what he is. Because there's no meaningful sense whatsoever in which Steve Bannon supports any kind of economically redistributionist anything. He's certainly more of a protectionist about trade than Republicans like David Froome are. But what of it, right? McKinley was a huge fan of tariffs. The Republicans who were trying to stop FDR from enacting the New Deal in the 1930s were all way more protectionist about trade than Steve Bannon is. And once you go beyond trade, it's a big nothing, right? Like, even if Bannon had gotten his way in the Trump White House and he'd gotten everything that he was advocating, what was that exactly? Well, he wanted to raise taxes he wanted to raise the top marginal tax rate back to a level that was closer to what it was during the Clinton years and use some of the money for infrastructure projects. The idea that this is some sort of exciting populist economic platform is a weird insult. Really? Right? Like that's what passes for economic populism in the GOP, that we're going to raise top marginal taxes to closer to what they were in the Clinton 1990s, not exactly a socialist utopia, and spend some of the money on infrastructure. It's pathetic. And similarly, Tucker Carlson, I've had people say, oh, Tucker Carlson is a big economic populist. And what they'll point me to, I've had this experience certainly on Twitter when I've said, hey, Tucker Carlson is in no way an economic populist. What are you people talking about? And of course, somebody says infrastructure projects makes them think of the Doozers from Fraggle Rock. It's been a very long time since I watched that. But what they'll do is they'll point me to this segment that he did last year sometime. I think it was like early 2019, or no, sorry, it was late 2019. It was like leading up to the primaries about Elizabeth Warren, and he was praising this statement that Elizabeth Warren had put out about economic patriotism. And of course, you could see why Tucker Carlson would like talk of economic patriotism. That's exactly his bag rhetorically. But what's the actual policy upshot of that? If you watch that segment to the end, the only specific policy proposals that come out of the Warren campaign, not that Warren was great, but no, I always think of Tucker Carlson like he's so obviously a hack. Like, up until a couple of years ago, he was exactly the kind of conservative that the guys on Chapo call a bow tie dipshit, and he was just straight down the line conventional GOP stuff. And he kind of rebranded himself as this dime store Father Coughlin. But again, what's the economic substance? He uses this he claims that his opposition to immigration is about concern for the working class that's already in the United States. They're going to keep out immigrant workers out of concern for native-born workers. But first of all, what the actual policy is there is getting ICE to round up impoverished working class people and stick them in cages and stick their children in different cages. That's not exactly a great pro-working class policy there. And second, if he was so concerned with the native-born working class, then why wouldn't he want to give them health care? Right? Tucker Carlson doesn't support Medicare for all. Tucker Carlson doesn't support a Green New Deal to create millions of new jobs, good public sector union jobs. He doesn't support Bernie Sanders' plan for postal banking. In fact, he's mocked concerns about the Trump administration trying to dismantle and privatize the postal service. He'll sometimes criticize companies like Amazon because Jeff Bezos pays so low wages, and it's like, oh, it's not economically patriotic. But again, that's just individual moralism the way he does it, because it's not tied to any kind of policy. He doesn't want to actually make Bezos pay anybody higher wages they can actually live on, right? He doesn't support the movement for a $15 minimum wage, and he never has. If you watch to the end of that segment, people are always pointing to as the evidence that Tucker Carlson is such a great economic populist. When you get to the actual end of the segment, the only specific Elizabeth Warren economic proposals that he actually endorses in the entire thing are more apprenticeship programs and getting the federal government to buy American where possible. Again, it's just a weird insult to treat this as some sort of inspiring program of economic populism, that especially at a time when this many millions of people are out of work, this many millions of people don't have access to good health care. I don't know, we'll give you a few more apprenticeship programs, a few infrastructure projects. It's just horrendous nonsense. But that brings us to, somebody said, I don't know, Carlson's replacement would be any better. That's certainly true. I remember thinking that when Rush Limbaugh got his cancer diagnosis, and Limbaugh is obviously a scumbag. He was a completely vile human being. Enough people that I love have died of cancer that I find getting happy about any human being getting cancer distasteful. But mostly what bothered me when people are like, oh, this is so awesome, Limbaugh is going to go off the air. It's like, you understand that the radio stations aren't switching ownership, right? Like Clear Channel, I think that's who still owns all those radio stations, right? Clear Channel isn't going to bring in Sam Cedar to give him Rush Limbaugh's old 12 to 3 p.m. Spot on AM radio. Like if that happened, that would be a victory for the left. But this is just normal, sad human shit. People get old, they get sick, they die. There's no victory for the left there, because the politics of whoever fills Limbaugh's slot is going to be exactly the same. And similarly with the Tucker Carlson thing, if I don't know, whatever happened with his writer turning out to be a white supremacist, which, shocker, or any future Tucker Carlson scandal got rid of Tucker Carlson, it wouldn't really matter, because it's not like Fox. If Tucker Carlson goes off the air, it's not like Fox is going to bring in, I don't know, Natalie Wynn, to do an hour-long version of nightly version of her YouTube segments to replace him. It's not like they're going to do, it's not like the Tucker Carlson show is going to become the Nathan Robinson show. Instead, it's just going to be some other horrendous right-wing asshole instead of this horrendous right-wing asshole. It's meaningless, right? This obsession with individual, if we're going to use the sort of creepy corporate terminology, content creators, as people, right? Just completely misses the boat, right? Like, this is the fact that somebody has this particular job dishing out ruling class propaganda. Somebody else is going to get that job. It's meaningless. It's nonsense. Look, I would love it if Natalie Wynn had a show on Fox. That would be, man, I'd watch Fox all the time. I think that'd be amazing, but unfortunately, that's never going to happen unless, of course, Fox is, I don't know, nationalized or turned into a worker cooperative or something like that, and that would be the prize that the eyes should be kept on as far as any sort of media critique, right? Not the individual people who are dishing out the propaganda, but who owns it. If the same people own it, they're just going to find somebody else to do the same thing. But in any case, the point about this sort of ridiculous, fake nonsense populism of somebody like Tucker Carlson, somebody like Steve Bannon, somebody like Josh Hawley, who also doesn't support Medicare for all or $15 minimum wage or any of that stuff, does bring me to one of the things that I meant to talk about in the stream, which was Thomas Frank's book, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. So it's a really interesting book. I just recently finished reading it, and I'm going to be talking to Frank about it on episode 5 of Give Them an Argument, which is recording a week from today. Somebody asked about the fairness doctrine, which did put some of this stuff in check, but again, is long since gone. Again, neoliberalism, right? The deregulation of the few restraints that we had on the basic impulses of normal capitalism. The book that I was mentioning, somebody asked about in chat. So this is Thomas Frank, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism, and it's very good and very strongly recommend it. Frank starts by talking about the actual populists, the people who made up the word. This would be the People's Party in the late 19th century, which was probably the most viable third party that's existed, just in terms of sheer electoral viability, since the Republican Party was a third party, right? When Abraham Lincoln was running for president. Number 2, of course, would be the Socialist Party with Eugene Debs, which is certainly the historic third party that I like the most, but probably the People's Party had more electoral support than the later Socialist Party did, although parts of what became the Socialist Party were fragments of that old People's Party that made up the word populism in the first place, which, by the way, is kind of funny in terms of the way we think about populism as this anti-intellectual thing, because, of course, they were getting the word from the Latin, right? Populi, right? That's which is kind of funny to think about, right? That in that train ride that he talks about at the beginning of the book, where a couple of big populists came up with the word, and in the book, he talks about this kind of thriving little industry, I'd say cottage industry, but honestly, it almost seems more like mass production at this point, that exists now, especially in the Trump era, but for a long time before that, of what's sometimes called global populism studies. Somebody asked about a Frank book that was released in 2002. Not sure what you're talking about. His most famous book probably is What's the Matter with Kansas, which was published in 2004, I believe. But in any case, What's the Matter with Kansas was 2004. That's his most famous one. Back then, Democrats liked him. Matt Taibbi gets into this in his book, Hate Inc., which I also read recently, and I'd also extremely strongly recommend. It's a really good book of media criticism. Even Nathan Robinson, who's been much more critical than I have of Taibbi, recommended Hate Inc., so everybody should read that. But in Hate Inc., Taibbi talks about how regular Democrats and liberals used to love Thomas Frank because of What's the Matter with Kansas. Now, the reason they loved it is because they didn't actually read the book. They only read the title, but just based on the title and a vague idea of what it was about, you would think that it's, here's this book about how poor people in Kansas vote against their self-interest. And so because they liked making that point, look at these yokels voting against their self-interest, they liked Frank in the book. Now, if they'd actually read it, they would see that in a lot of ways, he's anticipating the success of the 2016 Bernie campaign, in a lot of those states. And a lot of the polling that shows that even some people who voted for Trump would have voted for Bernie as the nominee, because his explanation of what's the matter with Kansas is that in a time when neither of the parties seemed to be representing the economic interests of ordinary people, that led to people voting on the basis of these cultural issues, which could be exploited with this kind of cultural pseudo-populism by the right. But his recommended solution to that was that the Democratic Party go left economically. So they praised the book, but they ignored the recommendations, probably because they didn't read it to the end. Not that they wouldn't have ignored it anyway. Then in 2016, he came out with a book called Listen Liberal. It's called Listen Liberal, Whatever Happened to the Party of the People. Now, I would quibble with the idea that the Democratic Party was ever the party of the people. I think it was always a party of one wing of capital, but it certainly was once more open to a certain kind of progressive populism than it is now, to put it mildly, right? And certainly the kind of like New Deal, Great Society, quasi-social democratic policies that the Democratic Party was pushing from the 30s through up until the 60s, then before the big neoliberal turn with Carter in the 70s. And so in Listen Liberal, I read that in 2016 when it first came out. I didn't read it. I listened to it. So kind of one dog walk or dishwashing at a time. And even though Bernie Sanders is never mentioned in the book, in effect, the book works as a really nice kind of code key for understanding what had just happened with that Bernie Hillary primary. Because he talks about the way that the Democratic Party has become ideologically the party of what he sometimes calls the liberal class, what other people call the professional class. The terminology that I use most often is PMC, which comes from Barbara Ehrenreich. I think she's the one who coined that. So that's professional managerial class. Or if you want to be a Marxist stickler about how classes are defined by relationship to the means of production, you can call it the professional managerial caste. But regardless, what we talk about this professional managerial class is a segment of the population that is defined by this sense of collective identity as not being workers, but being professionals. Now, some of these people are actually owners of their own businesses, like lawyers with their own firms, doctors with their own practices. Some of them are employees, right? So they're technically extremely privileged workers, like lawyers who have lucrative jobs working for huge firms where they're not partners. But what they have in common is certainly this sense of identity and this kind of cultural affinity for really fetishizing education and formal credentials and working up a certain kind of professional ladder. Very roughly, as somebody says in the chat, what we can talk about when we talk about polling data on whites with college degrees, that includes a lot of people who don't fall into this, but it also definitely includes these people. And the reason this is important to understand is because if you just say, okay, the Democratic Party serves corporate interests, well, it certainly does, right? But you haven't understood very much yet about the way that the Democratic Party functions to serve those interests. You haven't understood very much about the sort of ideological character of regular Democratic Party liberalism. And that's why I think Frank's book is Listen Liberal is absolutely indispensable, because I think he makes a really compelling case that especially since the 70s, ironically, some of this starts with McGovern, even though McGovern was a left-wing candidate, within the primaries at the time, and he was certainly an anti-war candidate and, supported some version of a UBI. But even so, starting with the McGovern campaign, and then especially after that, right, especially going up to the neoliberal Jimmy Carter campaign, the Democratic Party really made the shift away from seeing like industrial workers as its big base to start to really court these professional managerial class types. Think about that line from Chuck Schumer during the 2016 election, how, it's like we say, oh, maybe Trump will win some of these disaffected blue collar types, but don't worry about it, right? For every, unemployed coal miner, whatever phrase he used, that votes for Trump, we'll get two moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Of course, that didn't work out very well then. It worked out much better for them in the 2008 midterms. There's a lot to be said about that. I'd recommend that people read Matt Karp's article, Bernie's 5-Year Plan, in the new issue of Jacobin, for a deeper dive into some of the electoral dynamics there. But what all this means is that really, because of this big shift, because the Democratic Party really constantly giving voice to this kind of professional managerial class liberalism, it's really just a different conception of what progressivism is, right? So rather than having this kind of populist conception of progressivism, rather than having this kind of populist conception of progressivism that could at least go into a social democratic direction, and even if it's not socialism, right, at least somewhat points in the right direction, this version of mainstream Democratic Party liberalism really is fundamentally technocratic and meritocratic, right? It's technocratic in the sense that the ideal for how to solve various social problems, that word choice is important, problems, because these aren't seen as a result of clashes between competing economic interests, or even as a result of ideological clashes. Rather, what they're seeing as these kind of technical problems that could be fixed once all the smartest people take off their ideological blinders and get together to figure it out, right? This is why Barack Obama was so obsessed with the idea of a grand bargain with Republicans, to do something about the Golding deficit and to try to to slash Social Security and other entitlements, of course, as part of the bargain, because this was the vision they had, right? It's like Leibniz, right? The great philosopher and mathematician who co-invented the calculus independently of Isaac Newton, and he was also the inspiration for Dr. Pangloss and Candide. Very interesting guy, but he, in some ways, I think of him as the spirit animal of this kind of liberalism, because Leibniz has this line about how there'll come a time when we've gotten so clear on all the concepts that different philosophers won't have philosophical disputes anymore. They'll just say, let us sit down and calculate together, right? That all remaining intellectual problems will just be a matter of this kind of non-ideological, technical know-how, right? Let us calculate. And so that's the technocratic aspect, this idea that, the problem with conservatives isn't that they represent the interests of the 1%. It's not even that they have bad values. It's that they're letting ideology blind them to these important technical things. And that's the so that's the technocratic side of it. But the meritocratic side is that this kind of mainstream Democratic Party liberalism really defines what liberalism is, as opposed to the sort of old-fashioned New Deal, Great Society liberalism. It redefines. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened with the ad, still playing with the YouTube settings. But this what it does is it redefines what social justice is. So it's no longer about helping the people at the bottom of society. It's about making sure that the right people get to the top of the society. It's this meritocratic vision of justice, where the idea is that, look, 1,000 factory workers losing their jobs because the plant was relocated to some country with lower wages as part of an endless neoliberal race to the bottom, that doesn't even register as an injustice. It just registers as just this like natural process. It's like complaining about the weather, that, this is just the sort of natural, like it's this economic event that's like a natural event. But there not being enough female CEOs, that registers as an injustice on this worldview. So the idea is that on this meritocratic conception of liberalism, somebody says they joined the Patreon. You're now one of my favorite human beings. Please do that. Patreon.com/Ben Burgess. No, I did not know David Graeber. I actually listened to him a few weeks ago on Low Society, which is a podcast that I like. It's hosted by Peter and Ashley Coffin and Angie Speaks and her partner Jake. So I listened to David Graeber on that show, and I thought he was good, and it made me want to check out more of his work. I've only read a few essays. He's written a few books that are like infinite jest size that I haven't read. But in any case, so I was very sad to hear about him, but no, I didn't know him. I never had any contact with him. Actually, ironically enough, the night before he passed, someone suggested in a comment that I invite him to be on the show. So, but in any case, the point about Thomas Frank's argument in Listen Liberal about the redefinition of liberalism from that kind of New Deal Great Society conception is that this meritocratic vision of social justice is all about how racism and sexism and homophobia, these other things, are unjust because they block the best and the brightest from each group from rising to the top, right? So sexism means that we don't have very many CEOs. That's a social injustice problem. If racism means that that fewer of the best and the brightest Black people make it to the top of society, that's a problem. But if we just have massive grinding poverty that's racially disproportionate, that doesn't really register in the same way, even on this conception, as an injustice, right? This is very much present in the rhetoric that you get from people like the Clintons, people like Barack Obama, people, even Elizabeth Warren, I think, was a sort of weird halfway point between this kind of liberalism and something like a Bernie-cratic, social democratic view. And so I think Listen Liberal is just an enormously useful book for diagnosing it. But what Frank does in his new book, The People Know, a brief history of anti-populism, is to trace the development of anti-populism over the decades, and in the course of doing that, right, he really debunks a lot of what's been put out from this kind of anti-populist industry. Academics who do things like hold conferences for the study of global populism and have journals about this, the study, for like global populism study, and what disagree with Enche about analytic philosophy. Everybody should read the best analytic philosopher, who's G.A. Cohen, who wrote Karl Marx's Theory of History and a bunch of good anti-libertarian stuff. But in any case, so all of that stuff says, populism is anti-intellectual, populism is racist, populism is bad. Basically, populism equals Trumpism. And so in the first part of the book, what Frank does is he goes back to the original populists, the people, and he shows that all of those critiques are just completely wrong when applied to them. In fact, whereas, of course, in the late 1800s when the People's Party was active, the entire spectrum was vastly more racist than it is now. The person I just mentioned, somebody asked me about that, is G.A. Cohen. So Jerry Cohen, but G.A. Cohen. So he has the one that's got a lot of the good anti-libertarian stuff in it is called Self-Ownership, Freedom, and Equality. If you want to just read one of the best essays from that for free online, just Google it. It's all over the place. It's called The Structure of Proletarian Unfreedom. Really interesting Marxist analytic philosopher. But certainly you can find people who were populists in the 1800s. The original populists were very racist. No surprises there. But actually, if anything, the populists at the time were much less racist than the Democrats and Republicans, because at least some of them had some idea that it would be a good idea for poor white farmers to unite in solidarity with poor black farmers to fight the power of the big banks and the politicians who serve them. And in fact, the Bourbon Democrats very self-consciously use racial hatred as an anti-populist strategy. This is something Martin Luther King talked about. Frank quotes this speech that King gave about it in the book. Again, that's The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. And he talks in there about how the Bourbon Democrats, right, these powerful Southern Democrats, used racism to quash the populist revolt by really ramping up discrimination against black people, even encouraging race riots. And King has a great line in the speech where he says basically what the Bourbon Democrats were telling poor white people was, we're not going to fill your bellies, but you can eat Jim Crow. Which is a really fascinating speech to look back on now, right? For obvious reasons. And actually, it's funny because the thing that the original populists were mocked for, for being so anti-intellectual, was that was being opposed to the gold standard, right? So that's why William Jennings Bryan, who is the Democratic candidate who was endorsed by the People's Party, his famous speech was the Cross of Gold speech, is about how the gold standard was really bad for these struggling poor farmers and urban artisans and workers, and how we should get off it, right? So the moderate populist proposal was to switch to the silver standard, but the most extreme populists wanted to just have fiat currency. Like we have now. And so it's really funny looking back on the way that at the time this was seen as this and this is basically the image of the populace that we have because of people like Richard Hofstadter, the paranoid style in American politics really solidified it, that the idea was, these populists, they're anti-intellectual bumpkins because they think we can get off the gold standard, which is obviously pretty ironic now that we have been off of it for decades and decades, and restoring it is something that's only believed, advocated by cranks like Ron Paul people. So it's a really interesting. Somebody asked if I'd looked into Huey Long. Just a very little bit, not for a very long time. I should, but in any case, I remember my economics prof at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids when I was an undergrad was kind of obsessed with Long, but I think it's been a long, long time. And what Frank really talks about in the book is first how the original People's Party was profoundly different, from this anti-populist, cartoonish. Thank you to Greg, who I see just joined the Patreon. Much appreciated, brother. But how this anti-populist caricature that you get for these global anti-populism studies people now really does not at all fit with the original populists. In fact, how this was used as a way of calling even like liberals calling like McCarthyites populist, because it's like, oh, you're like just stupid anti-intellectual rubes like those People's Party people. And this ties into the rise of this explicitly anti-populist kind of liberalism that he diagnoses so nicely in Listen Liberal. So I'm going to be talking to Thomas Frank about all that stuff next weekend. We're going to record episode 5 next Saturday. Also, very closely related to the Thomas Frank stuff, I'm going to be talking to Freddie DeBoer about his new book, The Cult of Smart, which is also really good and really interesting. We were just talking about G.A. Cohen a minute ago, but what this makes me think of is the great philosopher, liberal political philosopher, John Rawls. And Rawls is somebody who I think is really interesting because people generally associate him with just welfare state liberalism. But Rawls, I think, was intellectually consistent enough to understand that to really fully embody these liberal ideals, you'd need to really get rid of the economic structure of capitalism. That's the conclusion you come to by the end of his life. If you read his book, Theory of Justice is the big thick one everybody knows, but if you read this later, much thinner book that he wrote called Justice is Fairness, a Restatement, he says in there that actually capitalism, even welfare state capitalism, couldn't fully embody the kind of idealism of the ideals of human equality and fairness that he advocates. And the reason that the Freddie DeBoer thing makes me think about Rawls, even though it's not a connection, at least so far, I'm not done reading it yet, that DeBoer makes in the book is that Rawls was such a fierce critic of meritocracy. Basically, the point that Rawls makes, which is very similar to the point that DeBoer makes in the book, is, look, of course it's true that we don't have real meritocracy. DeBoer starts out by talking about the big college admission scandals from a year ago, 2 years ago, whenever that was, that really show how hollow a lot of the alleged meritocracy is. But DeBoer's point that connects to Rawls's point is, okay, so if we did have a real meritocracy, would that be good, right? And because honestly, I think about this like, oh, imagine what a real meritocracy would be like. Distribution of wealth, status, and social rewards really was about raw talent. It was about talent and intelligence and all of those things. Basically, you're describing the movie Gattaca, right? Because after all, just like physical abilities vary from person to person, I think that, most, like, even if I had done nothing with my life except for to play basketball all day, every day, since I was old enough to walk, I would not be able to do what LeBron James does. Because not everybody starts with the same physical abilities. Similarly, not everybody starts with the same intellectual abilities. There's a whole range there. And isn't it monstrously unjust to say that some people can't have the same share of society's resources, they can't have the same outcomes because of something totally outside of their control, which is Rawls's point about meritocracy. Now, Rawls doesn't think incentives are necessarily bad. Right, that like it might sometimes be good, and maybe this partially answers Sarkat's question in the chat. It's sometimes useful to say, oh, some people can have a little bit more than others in order to incentivize them using their talents to do things that benefit society as a whole. But that's a little bit different from meritocracy as an ideal. What you have should be a function of your talent, because the standard is different, right? Like, we're not just sort of giving out resources for being so immensely talented, which is really what people who say they care about meritocracy care about. They oftentimes use phrases like hard work, but if hard work were what we cared about, then if two people were doing the same job and one of them had to work twice as hard as the other one to get the same results because he just wasn't as good at it, we'd reward the one who had to work twice as hard, twice as much. And of course, that's not what anybody who talks about meritocracy advocate. So what they're really talking about is raw talent. But again, that's the part that's the least under your control. Of course, talents can be honed. LeBron wouldn't be LeBron without, decades of constant practice. But it's not entirely under your control. There's an element of it that's very much outside of your control. So if you're going to give some people more than others for use of their talents, and this is going to be just, this is Rawls's point, it can't just be because we're rewarding the talent itself. It has to be because we're rewarding your use of the talent to do things that benefit everybody else as an incentive, which, by the way, even Karl Marx doesn't disagree with. Read the first chapter of the Critique of the Gotha Program, where Marx is criticizing the Lassalleans for talking about giving everybody an equal share of the products of a post-capitalist economy. And Marx says, well, I'm not sure how realistic that is in the first phase of socialism. Maybe we'll eventually achieve this higher phase where there's so much material abundance and so many things have been automated away. He doesn't directly say that in Critique of the Gotha Program, but I think if you read it in conjunction with the fragment on machines from the Grundrisse, then you kind of get the idea, right, of what he sort of imagined as that higher stage of communism. But and then, people can just sort of pursue their passions and take what they need. I think of like Aaron Bastani, fully automated luxury communism, and that would be great, right? But Marx says, in the meanwhile, right, in any sort of lower phase socialist society we can realistically imagine, we will need, for various reasons, right, to if you need to incentivize, hard work, whatever, you might need a somewhat, unequal distribution. But of course, a somewhat unequal distribution that actually meets that Rawlsian standard that, it's only okay to have a little bit of inequality if, one, you have meaningful equality of opportunity for the better off positions, which obviously we don't have in any capitalist society, and two, if the inequality tends to benefit people who are at the bottom of society, right? In other words, that if you had to choose, you're behind Rawls's veil of ignorance. That's just a fancy way of saying you knew you were going to have to live in the society. You didn't know what your position in the society was going to be. Then you might still choose to have one with a slightly unequal distribution if that was going to lead to innovations that benefit everybody. That's fine, right? But of course, you don't need the kind of grotesque inequalities that capitalism generates to have that happen, because the important point, right? This is what Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha Program, that the Lassalleans are making a mistake by overemphasizing this question of the distribution of goods, when what they should really be focusing on is who owns the means of production in the first place. Because if you have this external owner who owns a factory, for example, and is going to decide how to distribute the proceeds from the sale of the goods, somebody asked in the chat about doing a show on analytic Marxism. I'll absolutely do that at some point. That would be fantastic. Someday I'd like to write a book about G.A. Cohen. It's going to be a couple books down the line, but it's an idea I've had for a long time. But in any case, right, that under capitalism, if you have this external owner who's deciding how to divvy up the product, the proceeds from the products that are sold in the factory, so they're made in the factories and sold in the stores or whatever, between him and the workforce, then of course he has an incentive to give himself the lion's share. Whereas if workers control the means of production, either in a completely planned economy like Marx was imagining, or in some sort of market socialist setup on the Mondragon model, you look at Mondragon, that huge federation of worker co-ops in Spain, and the gap between the worst paid and the best paid people at Mondragon is like this compared to regular capitalist corporations that are like this. There's no way that you might need some inequality in resources to provide incentives for certain things, but that doesn't mean that you need to have some people be paid 400 times more than other people are paid. That's completely absurd. And that's something that is going to open some people up to completely unreasonable domination by others because they're so much worse off. They'll be economically dependent. That's something that means you can't have a meaningful democracy, because when you have concentrated wealth, you're always going to get concentrated political power. Trying to have concentrated wealth without concentrated political power is like hoping that water will just somehow flow upstream. It's a fantasy. So anyway, that was a big sidetrack on Rawls, but the Freddie DeBoer book is a different kind of critique of meritocracy and of the way that we idolize certain kinds of intellectual achievement, not because DeBoer is anti-intellectual, man's got a PhD, right? And that means, no problem, Andy. I'll talk to you later. What that means in practice is that we end up sending this terrible message to people who might, for example, be struggling with school, not because of outside impediments, but just because some people are, like any skill, right? There's going to be variation. And if we don't really have a decent path to a good, well-paying job that doesn't involve that, then again, that's unjust in a lot of the same ways the setup in Gattaca is unjust, just to keep referring to that movie. So really the problem is with this constant pressure, both economically or even for people like the people in those college admission scandals. These parents whose children were going to be just fine whether or not they got it at Stanford or USC or whatever, but for that, so much of status is built up in that. I think that's what DeBoer is critiquing in the book. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I think it's going to pair in a really interesting way with the conversation with Thomas Frank, especially thinking about some of what Thomas Frank says about this kind of meritocratic liberalism in his book, Listen Liberal. So I'm really looking forward to that. We've also, of course, next week got another installment of Outlaws and Revolutionaries with David Griscom. That's the segment where Griscom has been coming on for a few minutes at the end of every episode, and we drink a little whiskey and talk about country music and the politics of country music. And it's been really fun. So we're going to do that again. Also, I almost forgot, Christopher Payne, which is not his real name. I think that's just a Facebook nom de plume, but I've blanked on what his real name is. My apologies, Christopher. But he has been doing this really this really interesting project, this really fun project for many years now, the Iowa City Police Logs, and this is just turning into a book that's about to come out. And so basically what he's been doing for years and years and years, like I've been friends with him on Facebook, so I was seeing this before it even became a project that was separate from him, is that he would go through these logs that the Iowa City Police Department posted online from complaints, citizen complaints, and 911 calls. So these are things that people would call the police to complain about. And then after he'd been doing it for a couple of years, it became its own Facebook page and website. And, basically what he does is he picks the most absurd things that people are calling the police about. There are some, there are some kids, outside who look a little sketchy and they smell like weed. You have to come over here right away, right? And some of them are much funnier than that. And it's a very lighthearted thing, but it's also like a really disturbing look into part of the kind of cultural trickle-down effect of the carceral state, because it's just kind of amazing what utter nonsense nothings people will call the cops on each other about, and whether you agree with that part of the left that thinks that we can ultimately abolish the police and replace with something else, or whether you think, okay, maybe we can't do that, but we could at least have a much more stripped down, much more democratically accountable, much less militarized version of the police. Whichever one of those things you think, I think that it's Victor, follow my Twitter. I'll put out some links on this, but it's whichever one of those you think. If we're going to get there, right, we definitely need to create a culture that's much less calling the cops crazy than this one. And so anyway, I think it's funny, it's lighthearted, but it's also a valuable contribution to that project. So I'll be talking to him. I'll be talking to Freddie DeBoer about the cult of smart. I'll be talking to Thomas Frank about the People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. And of course, there's David Griscom for Outlaws and Revolutionaries at the end. And then the week after that, going to have Emma Vigeland and Nando Vila. I was just on the podcast that Nando does about Entourage. She's been rewatching it into the pandemic and, laughing at the absurd parts and feeling nostalgic, for some of the rest. But in any case, those are all going to be fun conversations. I hope people tune in to watch all of that. Please, I know this is the most cliched thing to say at a stream ever, but please like and subscribe to the channel. Please get on the Patreon if you possibly can. That's patreon.com/Ben Burgess. You get early access to all the episodes. I've also been not great about this in the time since Michael died, and my writing habits have gotten a lot worse. But I'm also trying to do regular weekly essays for patrons, and I've also been unlocking some of the old ones for non-patrons. So yeah, please check all that out. Get on the Patreon if you can. I totally understand if you can't. Check out the show. If you're a fanatical completist and you like to watch things from the beginning, this is a perfect time to start either listening to the podcast or watching on YouTube, because so far there are only 4 episodes. And it's great stuff. Been feeling very lucky about the guests we've gotten so far. Really looking forward to a lot of the plans for the future. But meanwhile, I have a podcast that I said I'd go on at 5:30. So I have to end the stream, but thank you so much, guys, for watching. Love you all. Left is best. Goodbye.